Well, you can find lots of really interesting things on YouTube. Bloopers and outtakes from old TV shows, musical numbers from movies and Broadway. You can even find actually another D. Scott Cooper who makes history videos. One YouTube video shows an installation where French artist Bernard Prat has meticulously placed seemingly random objects, carefully selected by color and size, on the floor of a museum. Walking around the installation, it literally looks like a pile of junk. But when the viewer moves to a very certain place and looks through a carefully placed frame, the image of a famous portrait appears, created by the placement of all those random objects. Of course, just because the intended image only appears from one viewpoint doesn't mean there is only one way to look at the sculpture. Sculptures give us a chance to walk around an artist's work and appreciate different perspectives. In fact, you really wouldn't appreciate the view through the frame without having looked at the objects from several different vantage points. Now, according to an e-counseling platform website, when life presents us with a situation, we usually decide what meaning the situation has for us almost immediately. That meaning is the frame we give it. We don't have to continue viewing it in that frame, though. Instead, we can give it a different meaning by changing the way we think and feel about it. I started thinking about reframing how we look at things for a couple of reasons. Our theme right now is Reimagine, and some folks aren't sure how to begin doing that. I thought it might help to suggest we can begin by reframing what we're talking about. There are a lot of sources online describing how to reframe things, especially in the business world. The Fast Company website advises us to begin by questioning the question we're asking in the first place. Warning, your answer may be baked into your question. The example they give is, when you ask, how should we plan a birthday party for David? You're assuming it's a party. If you change the question to, how can we make David's day memorable? Or, how can we make David's day special? You will find different sets of solutions. And this brings us to several different points, important points I'd like us to think about this morning. There are people, often influential or powerful, who would have us think the only frame to see things through is the one they suggest or even insist upon. So I wondered, who gets to decide? Many people, including many of us, would cross swords with anyone who insists we must see things their way. But how do we deal with those who claim that same right but diametrically disagree with us? And what prompts us to push back, and what criteria do we use when we disagree with established beliefs or customs? People are often compelled to reframe an aspect of their lives when the present situation isn't working or is even unsustainable, doesn't speak to who they authentically are, or simply doesn't provide the support they need. The idea of family has been reframed, especially in the last 50 years. Family of choice, or chosen family, has become a more prevalent concept with an increase in individualism combined with the necessity for social support. When a person's family of origin can't or won't fulfill the role of support system, a person will often find a group that will step in. Our reading this morning was a young woman's reflection on chosen family. Besides faith communities, families of choice are common within the LGBT community, groups of veterans, supportive communities overcoming physical or substance abuse, and friend groups who have little to no contact with their biological parents. More and more people are living independently, I mentioned the increase in individualism a moment ago. The number of one-person households has nearly tripled in the United States since 1975. This, as well as the rising incidence of gay families with children, has evolved the cultural understanding of family and its subsequent social norms. Televisions reflected the changes to some degree. The idealized suburban family of the mid-20th century, the Cleavers, gave way to single parents, Andy Taylor, Eddie's father, and later Shirley Partridge. Blended families were front and center when Carol Martin wed Mike Brady, and they, their kids, and wisecracking Alice became the Brady Bunch. More recently, modern families showcase three different kinds of families: a nuclear family consisting of the parents and their biological kids, a blended family, like the Bradys, but with a bit more Latin flair, and two married gay men who have adopted a daughter. Many of us remember Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, but today, many people don't even know their next-door neighbors. The idea of neighborhood is also being reframed by some. This afternoon, there's an online information session for those of you interested in co-housing here in Houston. Check Friday's newsletter for the link. That's where I learned that in a housing community, support is next door and neighbors work together, and meals and yard work are shared. When people are compelled to reframe an aspect of their existence to better their lives, it sometimes leads them to consider reframing other things in their lives as well. This happened to me. The UU Church in Dallas has a version of small group ministry, and several years ago I had joined the monthly LGBT group. I remember one other member of the group echoing my exact thoughts about the cause and effect of his realizing he was gay and his attitude towards organized religion. He and I separately had realized that if people were misinterpreting or misrepresenting what the Bible supposedly said about being gay, what else was being misrepresented or misinterpreted? This reframing of our thinking opened up new perspectives that caused us to leave many assumptions and attitudes behind, and eventually led us to the UU Church. Unitarians and Universalists have long pushed back against other people, insisting things had to be viewed the way those others had framed them. Our theological ancestors lost the vote, yes, it was a vote, regarding the unity versus Trinity of God in Nicaea in AD 325. A millennium and a half later, William Ellery Channing was helping to define Unitarianism in North America by not only rejecting the concept of the Trinity, but espousing a belief in human goodness and the subjection of theological ideas to the light of reason. At the same time, the Universalists were spreading the heretical notion that God loved everyone and that no infinite being would send a finite creation to infinite torment for finite mistakes. Bishop John Shelby Spong, whom I mentioned earlier in the service, in referring to the Gospel of Matthew, asked, "How divine is the message that says, for your finite failings you will be cast into the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth?" Most of those on my social media feed have mourned the loss of Bishop Spong, who died a week ago. Friends from seminary, as well as other liberal ministers, have looked up to his scholarship, as well as his courage to question antiquated and misguided interpretations of Scripture. But sometimes when I descend in my liberal bubble into Facebook, like Glinda the Good into Munchkin Land, a high school acquaintance or person I know on Toastmasters will express an opposite view. One posted a link to Spong's obituary with a preface, "I cannot in good conscience provide my normal honorific to a heretic who so damaged the church. Let us simply acknowledge his passing. I share this social media post to reiterate my question. Who gets to decide? Who decides how Scripture is interpreted, or what is even considered Scripture? Decide whether God is one or three or none of the above. For centuries, the church insisted that good believers follow both Scripture and tradition. Many today still do. The tradition was insisted upon so that smarty pantses like Spong wouldn't go off and reinterpret the Bible themselves. Heaven only knows what conclusions they might arrive at, like God is one or there's universal salvation. My friend referred to Spong as a heretic, probably not realizing that there are those of us who don't take that as an insult. A heretic is someone who supports heresy, defined as any belief or theory that is strongly at variance with established beliefs or customs. As I've probably mentioned before, the word is derived from the ancient Greek heresis, and the English heresy originally meant choice, or thing chosen. So, heretics simply choose to believe something out of the mainstream or choose a different frame to examine the thing at hand. And in some cases, are examining the very same source material. In the mid-19th century, Universalist preachers and their Orthodox counterparts actually engaged in formal debates. The Universalist preachers were skilled debaters who read their Bible carefully and knew by heart the passages that denied the reality of eternal damnation. Clearly, there are those who don't believe the same things we do. Our suddenly missing Black Lives Matter flag is proof of that. I'm sure many of you don't believe all the same things I do, and vice versa. The current political situation and pandemic highlight the levels of disagreement in our country. There's a quote by the science fiction writer and professor of biochemistry, Isaac Asimov, that you may have seen. He wrote, "Anti-intellectualism has been a constant thread winding its way through our political and cultural life, nurtured by the false notion that democracy means that my ignorance is just as good as your knowledge." Visiting family, I was watching a cooking competition, as I often do when I'm not singing show tunes, and someone questioned the judging. They said, "Well, that's just their opinion, right?" I later thought, this shows how we dismiss the expertise of people who have devoted their lives to studying and practicing something. Accomplished chefs who have lived and breathed the thing they're judging their entire career. People who have devoted their lives to public service lose elections to those whose main talent seems to be to get people to identify with them. Medical professionals are scoffed at when people find contradictory anecdotes on the internet. No matter what we believe, there will be those who believe differently, and they will also claim the right to disagree with the prevailing view. While many of us might question the words of popes or televangelists, they might question the words of scientists and public servants. So, I ask, when we are questioning the prevailing views, what should we keep in mind to make us different? As usual, I may not have definitive answers, but I do have some things we can think about. A moment ago, I referred to William Ellery Channing espousing the subjection of theological ideas to the light of reason. I think using reason is a good place to start. Actually listening to people who have devoted their lives to studying something. But another way to decide whether to reframe something is to ask, is this a more kind, loving approach? Which perspective feeds my ego and need to be right? And which way demonstrates a caring approach to others? Not only might we consider the views of scientists and people who have spent their lives at spent their lives studying something as worthy of special consideration, but the views of people whose very lives give them a special knowledge. For instance, let's say there's a hymn that I'm told feels oppressive to a group of marginalized people. If I'm asked to not use that hymn, I need to recognize, as someone not in that marginalized group, my view about that hymn is not as valid as theirs. I shouldn't try to reason my way into using it if it hurts somebody. Now, reframing the question is also one of the more useful approaches I've learned to better try to understand other people. Earlier, I shared the advice that we should try questioning the question we're asking in the first place, because our answer may be baked into that question. When I'm tempted to ask, what kind of person would do that? I was taught to reframe the question to ask, what would lead a person to do that? Asking what kind of person would do that not only assumes the person is inherently different, probably somehow worse than I am, it assumes they had the same range of options I would have had in a similar circumstance. And so they made a bafflingly poor choice. During seminary, I worked at First Street Mission in Fort Worth. Underserved people would come and get groceries or clothing, and unsheltered people would come for lunch and coffee. One cold day in February, a woman came for groceries. She was wearing sandals. I remember wondering to myself, why in the world would someone wear sandals when it's so cold out? Which is really just another way of saying, what kind of person would do that? Well, as soon as I reframed the question to, what would lead a person to wear sandals in the cold, a logical answer sprang to my mind. She would wear sandals if those are the only shoes that she has. A simple reframing of the question led me from judging a person for making unhealthy and quirky wardrobe choices to wondering what it must be like to not be able to afford appropriate clothing for all types of weather. Of course, that's a pretty straightforward example. It gets more complex when we wonder why people have certain bumper stickers on their vehicle or don't get a vaccine. So while we're deciding for ourselves, so are people we don't agree with. How do we change them? We pretty much can't. If you've ever tried to change someone's mind in the comments section on social media, you know how impossible that can be. And along with reframing the question to better understand people comes this adage: we shouldn't expect others to be more willing to change their minds than we are to change ours. Otherwise, we're not listening, we're just trying to prove that we're right. While we can't change others, we can change ourselves. And make sure when we go against the prevailing opinion, we are doing so out of love, not ego. That we're not unconsciously asserting our position that my ignorance is just as good as your knowledge, or even vice versa. When we question others, we need to do so out of concern and not dismissal or animosity. When we reframe the question, we need to make sure it is to lift up the other, not denigrate. When we reimagine the world and we work for beloved community, it needs to be for all, not just those who share our viewpoint. Is all this really difficult to do? Yes, it's difficult to do. But we need to remember that just maybe, we can't always be sure which of us is staring at a pile of junk and which of us is looking through a frame, seeing a masterpiece.